أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. والعاديات ضبحا فالموريات قدحا فالمغيرات صبحا فأثرن به نقعا فوسطن به جمعا إن الإنسان لربه لكنود وإنه على ذلك لشهيد وإنه لحب الخير لشديد أفلا يعلم إذا بعثر ما في القبور وحصل ما في الصدور إن ربهم به يومئذ لخير. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. Surah Adiyat is the 100th surah of the Holy Quran and means the competing horses. The first 5 verses talk about the battle horses and create a very clear image of these horses in our mind. They are panting. There are sparks flying from their hooves as they strike the rocks, causing dust clouds to form. The surah then goes on to tell us that human beings are ungrateful towards Allah. The focus is that the human being is motivated when it comes to competing for worldly things, but they lack the same motivation for actions that will benefit them spiritually. The last 3 verses warn that Allah is aware of all things and that on the day of judgment, one will have to answer for all their actions. Salawat Allah.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم ارحم في هذه الدنيا غربتي وعند الموت كربتي وفي القبر وحدتي وفي اللحد وحشتي وإذا نشرت للحساب بين يديك ذل موقفي واغفر لي ما خفي على الآدمين من عملي وأدم لي ما به سترتني وارحمني صريعا على الفراش تقلبني أيادي أحبتي وتفضل علي ممدودا على المغتسل يغسلني صالح جيرتي وتحنن علي محمولا قد تناول الأقرباء أطراف جنازتي وجد علي منقولا قد نزلت بك وحيدا في حفرتي، وارحم في ذلك البيت الجديد غربتي، حتى لا أستأنس بغيرك يا سيدي، إن وكلتني إلى نفسي هلكت. سيدي فبمن أستغيث إن لم تقلني عثرتي، وإلى من أفزع إن فقدت عنايتك في ضجعتي، وإلى من ألتجئ إن لم تنفس كربتي. سيدي من لي ومن يرحمني إن لم ترحمني، وفضل من أؤمل إن عدمت فضلك يوم فاقتي، وإلى من الفرار من الذنوب إذا انقضى أجلي. سيدي لا تعذبني وأنا أرجوك. إلهي حقق رجائي وآمن خوفي، فإن كثرة ذنوبي لا أرجو لها إلا عفوك. سيدي أنا أسألك ما لا أستحق، وأنت أهل التقوى وأهل المغفرة، فاغفر لي وألبسني من نظرك ثوبا يغطي علي التبعات، وتغفرها لي ولا أطالب بها، إنك ذو من قديم وصفح عظيم وتجاوز كريم. إلهي أنت الذي تفيض سيبك على من لم يسألك، وعلى الجاحدين بربوبيتك، فكيف سيدي بمن سألك وأيقن أن الخلق لك والأمر إليك، تباركت وتعاليت يا رب العالمين. سيدي عبدك ببابه أقامته الخصاصة بين يديه، يقرع باب إحسانك بدعائه، فلا تعرض بوجهك الكريم عني، واقبل مني ما أقول، فقد دعوتك بهذا الدعاء وأنا أرجو ألا تردني معرفة مني برأفتك ورحمتك. إلهي أنت الذي لا يحفيك سائل ولا ينقصك نائل. أنت كما تقول وفوق ما نقول. اللهم إني أسألك صبرا جميلا وفرجا قريبا وقولا صادقا وأجرا عظيما. وأسألك يا ربي من الخير كله ما علمت منه وما لم أعلم. وأسألك اللهم من خير ما سألك منه عبادك الصالحون يا خير من سئل يا أجود من أعطى. أعطني سؤلي في نفسي وأهلي ووالدي وولدي وأهل حزانتي وإخواني فيك. وأرغد عيشي وأظهر مروتي وأصلح جميع أحوالي واجعلني ممن أطلت عمره وحسنت عمله وأتممت عليه نعمتك ورضيت عنه وأحييته حياة طيبة في أدوم السرور وأسبغ الكرامة وأتم العيش إنك تفعل ما تشاء ولا يفعل ما يشاء غيرك. اللهم خصني منك بخاصة ذكرك ولا تجعل شيئا مما تقربوا به في آناء الليل وأطراف النهار رياء ولا سمعة ولا أشرا ولا بطرا واجعلني لك من الخاشعين. اللهم وأعطني السعة في الرزق والأمن في الوطن وقرة العين في الأهل والمال والولد والمقام في نعمك عندي والصحة في الجسم والقوة في البدن والسلامة في الدين واستعملني بطاعتك وطاعة رسولك محمد وأهل بيته صلواتك عليه وآله أبدا ما استعمرتني واجعلني من أوفر عبادك عندك نصيبا في كل خير أنزلته في شهر رمضان في ليلة القدر وما أنت منزله في كل سنة من رحمة تنشرها وعافية تلبسها وبلية تدفعها وحسنات تتقبلها وسيئات تتجاوز عنها وارزقني حج بيتك الحرام في عامنا هذا وفي كل عام وارزقني رزقا واسعا من فضلك الواسع واصرف عني يا سيدي الأسواء واقض عني الدين والظلامات حتى لا أتأذى بشيء منه وخذ عني بأسماعي أعدائي وأبصاري حسادي والباغين علي وانصرني عليهم وأقر عيني وفرج قلبي واجعل لي من همي وكربي فرجا ومخرجا واجعل من أرادني بسوء من جميع خلقك تحت قدمي واكفني شر الشيطان وشر السلطان وسيئات عملي وطهرني من الذنوب كلها وأجرني من النار بعفوك وأدخلني الجنة برحمتك وزوجني من الحور العين بفضلك والحقني بأوليائك الصالحين محمد وآله الأبرار الطيبين الطاهرين الأخيار صلواتك عليه وعليهم وعلى أرواحهم وأجسادهم ورحمة الله وبركاته. إلهي وسيدي وعزتك وجلالك لئن طالبتني بذنوبي لأطالبنك بعفوك ولئن طالبتني بلؤمي لأطالبنك بكرمي ولئن أدخلتني النار لأخبرن أهل النار بحبي إياك إلهي وسيدي إن كنت لا تغفر إلا لأوليائك وأهل طاعتك فإلى من يفزع المذنبون وإن كنت لا تكرم إلا أهل الوفاء بك فبمن يستغيث المسيئون إلهي إن أدخلتني النار ففي ذلك سرور عدوك وإن أدخلتني الجنة ففي ذلك سرور نبيك وأنا والله أعلم أن سرور نبيك أحب إليك من سرور عدوك. اللهم إني أسألك أن تملأ قلبي حبا لك وخشية منك وتصديقا لك وإيمانا بك وفرقا منك وشوقا إليك يا ذا الجلال والإكرام. حبب إلي لقاءك وأحبب لقائي واجعل لي في لقائك الراحة والفرج والكرامة. اللهم ألحقني بصالح من مضى واجعلني من صالح من بقي وخذ بسبيل الصالحين وعني على نفسي بما تعين به الصالحين على أنفسهم واختم عملي بأحسنه واجعل ثوابي منه الجنة برحمتك وأعني على صالح ما أعطيتني وثبتني يا ربي ولا تردني سوء استنقذتني من يا رب العالمين. اللهم إني أسألك إيمانا لا أجل له دون لقائك أحيني ما أحييتني عليه وتوفني إذا توفيتني عليه وبعثني إذا بعثتني عليه وأبرئ قلبي من الرياء والشك والسمعة في دينك حتى يكون عملي خالصا لك. اللهم أعطني بصيرة في دينك وفهما في حكمك وفقها في علمك وكفلين من رحمتك وورعا يحجزني عن معاصيك وبيض وجهي بنورك واجعل رغبتي فيما عندك وتوفني في سبيلك على ملة رسولك صلواتك عليه وآله. اللهم إني أعوذ بك من الكسل والفشل. اللهم أعوذ بك من الكسل والفشل والهم والحزن والجبن والبخل والغفلة والقسوة والذلة والمسكنة والفقر والفاقة وكل بلية والفواحش كلها ما ظهر منها وما بطن. وأعوذ بك من نفس لا تقنع ومن بطن لا يشبع ومن قلب لا يخشع ومن دعاء لا يسمع وعمل لا ينفع وصلاة لا ترفع. وأعوذ بك يا ربي عن نفسي وديني ومالي وعلى جميع ما رزقتني من الشيطان الرجيم إنك أنت السميع العليم. اللهم إنه لن يجيرني منك أحد، ولن أجد من دونك ملتحدا، فلا تجعل نفسي في شيء من عذابك، ولا تردني بهلكة، ولا تردني بعذاب أليم. اللهم وتقبل مني، وأعل ذكري، وارفع درجتي، وحط وزري، ولا تذكرني بخطيئتي، واجعل ثواب مجلسي وثواب منطقي وثواب دعائي رضاك عني والجنة، واعطني يا ربي جميع ما سألتك، واعطني يا ربي جميع ما سألتك، واعطني يا ربي جميع ما سألتك، وزدني من فضلك، إني إليك راغب يا رب العالمين. اللهم إنك أنزلت في كتابك، اللهم إنك أنزلت في كتابك أن نعفو عمن ظلمنا، وقد ظلمنا أنفسنا، فاعف عنا، فإنك أولى بذلك منا، وأمرتنا ألا نرد سائلا عن أبوابنا، فقد جئناك سؤالا، فلا تردني إلا بقضاء حاجتي، وأمرتنا يا ربي بالإحسان إلى ما ملكت أيماننا، ونحن أرقاء، فاعتق رقابنا من النار، يا مفزعي عند كربتي، ويا غوثي عند شدتي، إليك فزعت وبك استعنت ولوذت، ولا ألوذ بسواك، ولا أطلب الفرج إلا بك، وأغثني وفرج عني يا من يقبل اليسير ويعفو عن الكثير. اقبل مني اليسير واعف عني الكثير، إنك أنت الغفور الرحيم. اللهم إني أسألك إيمانا تباشر به قلبي، ويقينا صادقا، حتى أعلم أنه لن يصيبني إلا ما كتبت لي، ورضني من العيش بما قسمت لي يا أرحم الراحمين. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Just a quick announcement for parents whose children are in the T4L activities. You don't need to go to collect them at 8 o'clock. They will be brought in here just after 8. So for today's talk, marriage, a path to distress, right? Or the key to sanity. Please welcome Dr. Abbas Ramji. The salawat.
So, A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. So, it's an honor and privilege to be asked to speak here. The topic title seems to have generated a bit of interest, so let's hope I can sort of live up to the expectations. So, marriage, the key to sanity or the path to distress. I know it's the last Friday before Eid, the last few minutes before iftar, so I'm hungry. I don't know if you guys are. I'm quite tired. So what I'd like to do is to actually have this as an interactive discussion and help us. And I'd like to have as much participation as possible. So there'll be various times when I'll be prompting, sort of inviting people to give their reflections, their thoughts. And I'm a strong believer that personal reflection is as important as the evidence as well. So just see if I can. There we go. Okay. So before I go ahead with the presentation, I'd just like to give some acknowledgements. So today's presentation is loosely based on a piece of research I was invited to be participating in and contributing to that was presented at the Fiqh workshop last year here at Al Mahdi in July 2022. So the title of the piece of research that was done at the time was called A Maqsadi Approach to Islamic Marriage, Reassessment of Surah Rum, verse number 21. So this was a truly multidisciplinary approach to looking at Islamic marriage. It was led by Professor Sayyid Fatimi, Dr. Munzila Raza, and Sheikh Ahmad Kauri. And they provided the fiqh perspective on Islamic marriage and the tafsir approach from the Quran. And I was asked to provide some of the medical evidence as to looking at whether marriage contributes to mental health and well-being. So first of all, what is the purpose of marriage? What's the point? Why do we get married? What's the aim? Any thoughts, any ideas? As I said, I'd like this to be an interactive discussion. It's not just me giving a lecture. What's the purpose of marriage? Life partner, okay. So companionship. Yeah, any other thoughts? Okay, so to produce the next generation, we have to have children. Okay, any other thoughts? No? Stunned silence? Okay, so we've had a few thoughts. It's about sort of having a companion, having a life partner, having more children. So if we look at the actual Islamic jurisprudence, based on Islamic law, it's purely a contractual relationship, and that's it. Islamic law doesn't consider the other aspects, such as the spirit, the virtue, and the psychological sort of psychology behind matrimonial laws. And it seems, based on what Sayyid Fatimi and colleagues were sort of giving as part of that piece of research, jurists seem to be reluctant to look at the purpose of marriage, as there is uncertainty on how to derive purpose for itself. So I'd like to sort of touch on some of the Quranic verses that talk about the purpose of marriage. So there are a number of Quranic verses alluding to tranquility or sakina being the purpose of marriage and the purpose of creation of spouses. Okay, so the first verse is from Surah Rum, which is the verse that I referred to in the title, verse number 21. And it says, "And of his signs is that he created for you spouses from amongst yourselves, so that you may find tranquility in them. And he planted love, muwadda, and compassion, rahmah, between you. In this are signs for people who reflect." So that, I think, seems to resonate with some of the thoughts that were mentioned earlier about having some sort of companionship. Any thoughts on that first verse? Before we move on to the other verses, any thoughts or reflections on that first verse? Just give you a few seconds to sort of take that verse in. Okay. Okay. Can you expand on that? So, what are you giving and what you're receiving back? Okay. Yeah. So there's benefit of both spouses in the relationship. Okay, that's interesting. So the next verse is from Surah Nisa. So that's Surah number 4, verse number 128. I hope you can see that it's quite small. So it says, "There is no fault in them if they reconcile their differences, for reconciliation is best. Souls are prone to avarice, greed. Yet if you do what is good and practice piety, God is cognizant of what you do." So as we know, all relationships will have their ups and downs. There'll be falling outs, but there will be other days when the things are better. So I guess what God is saying here, or at least what I take from this verse, is that reconciliation is an important part of the marriage process and the journey when you have your life partner. And then the next two verses are from Surah Baqarah. Surah Baqarah is Surah number 2, obviously, and the two verses I'd like to focus on are verses number 229 and 231. Either retain them amicably or release them amicably. And the next verse goes on, either retain them amicably or release them amicably, but do not retain them to hurt them and commit aggression. Whoever does that has wronged himself, and do not take God's revelation for a joke. So quite a strong verse there, quite a strong statement here. Any thoughts or reflections on that, on those two verses? Okay. So justice is the overriding factor. Are you able to sort of expand on that a little bit more? No? So I guess what I take from this is that obviously sort of the verse from Surah Nisa 128 talks about reconciliation. And I think that's an overriding factor that I see through some of the other verses as well, that there will be ups and downs, but reconciliation is vital and it's important because as long as at some point in your marriage, further down the line, you can achieve that tranquility, that sakina, then reconciliation will help you achieve that because it's often not a very smooth journey. But obviously, at some point, if there is issues within a marriage, then the amicable relationship is very important. And obviously, there's negativity towards, it's frowned upon in terms of sort of having aggression, having sort of hurt within a relationship. And of course, it says here at the end, and do not take God's revelation for a joke. So obviously, marriage is a very sacred institution, and it should be upheld as such. The final verse I'd like to sort of mention is Surah Nisa, verse number 35. Again, talking about reconciliation, it says, if you fear a breach between the two, appoint an arbiter from his family and an arbiter from her family. If they wish to reconcile, God will bring them together. God is knowledgeable and expert. So again, talking more about reconciliation yet again, which is an overriding feature of all, and a theme that seems to go through all the verses. Any sort of thoughts or reflections here, having looked through those 5 different verses? Okay. 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 So, yeah, just to summarize, conflict will happen. It happens in all relationships. But reconciliation is really important, with perhaps with the purpose of achieving that sakina, that tranquility within that relationship. Is that what you get from it? Okay. So going back to the earlier slide, I mentioned that within Islamic law, Islamic fiqh, it's very black and white. It's basically a contract between two parties. So it doesn't really look at sort of tranquility, love, mawadda, rahmah, mercy. It doesn't look at all those concepts in the same way. So if we look at some of the mufassirin, here we go. So there seems to be a unanimous position amongst the Mufassirin on spousal tranquility being the purpose of marriage and the purpose of creation of spouses. So when Sayyid Fatimi and Dr. Munzala put together this presentation, they looked at Mufassirin through the ages, from back in 1075 through till the current day. So the various people like Al-Hasan al-Tabrisi, Fakhr al-Din al-Razi, Sayyid Muhammad Hussein Fadlullah, Sayyid Muhammad Hussein Tabatabai, Sayyid Muhammad Taqi Mudarrisi, and Nasir Makarim Shirazi up until the present day, they all unanimously agree that sakina, tranquility, is the cause of spousal creation and is also considered the purpose of marriage itself. So there seems to be some strong opinions there. Okay, so some observations, conclusions, and practical implications. And then we go on to some of the medical evidence as well, which I find personally really interesting. Okay, so all the Mufassirin of the Holy Quran unanimously agree and recognize that spousal relationships are created for the purpose of each spouse finding tranquility in each other. Allah calls mankind towards due diligence and objectivity, to understanding the true nature of these things, to avoid taking an emotionally charged stance. So as we discussed, there is sort of emotions, there are fallouts, there's disagreements within a marriage, but it's about achieving that purpose, that sort of sakina, that tranquility. And Allah is seen to be encouraging others to intervene and help reconcile spousal disputes to again cultivate a state of harmony and tranquility between the groups, between the two spouses. So as I mentioned, based on Islamic law, marriage is purely a contract. It's very black and white. It doesn't take into account compassion or empathy. But with the input of the Mufassirin, looking at the Holy Quran and some of the verses I've already alluded to earlier, we can conclude that spouses are created by Allah with the foundational purpose of tranquility, sakina, of mankind, achieved through means of spousal harmony, reciprocated kindness, love, mawadda, compassion, rahmah, and takamul, complementarity. Now, looking at the reverse side, given that tranquility is deemed to be the purpose or the maqsad in Allah's creation of spouses, from a jurisprudential perspective, and correct me, please do sort of jump in and correct me if I'm wrong, going forward, the lack of tranquility ever being achievable would seem to warrant the reassessment of the validity of marriage and the rights of spouses towards each other. Any thoughts or reflections? I don't know if you have got anything further to say, or anyone else has any sort of comments on that? Yeah, so I think what we've tried to establish is that tranquility is the purpose of marriage. It's the purpose of why spouses are created. So if you now have a marriage where there's a lack of that sort of purpose, lack of tranquility, could you question the validity of marriage itself, of that particular marriage? Okay. Yeah. So, yeah, absolutely. So I guess there's three parts of this that I'm trying to pull together now. So there's obviously the contract law, the Islamic fiqh. There's what the Mufassirin have said in terms of tranquility being the purpose of marriage. And then I'll come on to the medical evidence in a moment. So sort of what we've done here in this piece of research is actually brought together three different aspects in a multidisciplinary approach. So we're trying to integrate all three, really. I'll move on to the medical evidence, and then hopefully we can have a bit of discussion. So the psychosocial data. So this is something that I've really found quite interesting, and something that I wasn't sort of aware of until we did this piece of work. So I conducted a literature. Let's go back. I conducted a literature review last year, in March last year, and so we looked at all the papers available between 2003 up until last year when the literature review was done, and looked at sort of all the research papers on two of the largest databases about research to do with mental health, Embase and PsycInfo. And the search criteria that I used were marital discord and the impact this can have on the couple, and the impact this can have on the children and the family unit, taking into account psychological impact and the mental health outcomes in the medium to long term. So the aim here was actually to explore whether conflict or the absence of conflict, trust or the lack of trust, comfort or the lack of comfort within a relationship, and security or the lack of security within a relationship translates into mental health outcomes for the couple and any children. So there's actually quite a lot of research out there. We found 109 papers on this topic. So myself and Dr. Munzala went through all the papers and excluded quite a lot of them because they weren't particularly relevant to what we were looking at. And so there were 24 relevant studies. And the search criteria were quite narrow because then, for example, we looked at heterosexual relationships in a married or civil partnership, because otherwise it brings up a whole other topic altogether. So the key themes we found were okay. So there are 4 key themes that seem to be sort of transcending through all the papers that we looked at. First of all, significant mental health effects in spousal parties as a result of marital discord. So things like depression, anxiety are significantly increased in those relationships where there's a lot of continuous marital discord. Secondly, we found that there are significant mental health effects in the children as young as nursery or kindergarten when marital conflict is present and continues to be present throughout. Thirdly, we found that marital satisfaction and positive marital quality is associated with improved physical health outcomes. So not just mental health, but actually physical health outcomes are increased when there's positive marital satisfaction. So what are the predictors of marital quality? And the paper seems to sort of suggest that spousal emotional regulation, being in tune with each other's emotions, attitude similarity, and conflict resolution styles all have an effect on marital quality. Any surprises there? Any thoughts? Any disagreements? Yes, and I'll be talking about a paper that talks about that actually. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So there is a lot of evidence to say that actually if there's marital discord to the point that it becomes domestic violence, then potentially that has an impact on the mental health and well-being of the mother during pregnancy and on the child, unborn child as well. So I'll come on to that because I think that's the next slide actually. Okay, so this study is entitled Relationships Between Marital Quality, Social Support and Mental Health During Pregnancy. So I'm only going to touch on 4 different studies out of the 24 that we looked at, which basically highlight each of those key themes, or each of those 4 key themes. So this was a study involving 300 Iranian pregnant women, and it included some extensive literature review, which basically sort of found that marital satisfaction has a relationship between mental health, and mental disorders are common problems associated with poor maternal and fetal consequences. So what the evidence seems to suggest, and I think that's what you've already touched on, is that when there's marital discord that's prolonged, that can potentially include domestic violence, then there can be poor maternal health outcomes and fetal consequences. So things like increased risk of preeclampsia during pregnancy, postpartum depression, that's a depressive illness after birth of the child, preterm birth, and low birth weight. So this particular study looked at the marital quality and the mental health during pregnancy, and it was adjusted for age, and it showed that marital relationships and levels of depression were related, and they talked about sort of domestic violence as well as part of this. So the key conclusion from this study was that actually marital quality is an important predictor of mental health. So the next paper that I want to sort of highlight was a huge study involving over 10,500 participants in Nepal. So the prerequisite to this study is actually that marriage in general is associated with better mental health outcomes in high-income industrialized countries, so like the UK, for example. And what the authors of this piece of research wanted to do was to look at whether they can replicate that in Southeast Asia, in Nepal. So this was a study looking at over 10,500 participants over a 24-year period. It investigated the timing of marital transitions, and the timing of onset of major depressive disorder. That's what MDD stands for, major depressive disorder in both males and females. So when I talk about transitions in marriage, what the paper was talking about was changes within the marital status. So, for example, going through a divorce or becoming a widow. So those were the two key transitions that they were talking about here. So we can see here that for females, going through a divorce can increase the risk of major depression by over 2.6 times. And becoming a widow increases the risk of depression by over 11 times. And the numbers are even more stark in males. So for males, becoming a widow increased the odds of becoming depressed later on in life by 16 times. So there are significant impacts on your mental health as a result of these significant transitions in your marital status. Obviously, with any piece of research, there are going to be limitations, but one of the most important findings is that marital transitions can be associated with subsequent onset of major depression. This was actually quite interesting because it was the Nepal-specific context. Within the culture in Nepal, and spouses are often selected by parents, especially amongst women, and divorce can be rarely an option, or that women's roles within a marriage can be highly segregated. So I don't know if we can sort of draw some parallels between what we discussed here in terms of the cultural sort of specifics of Nepal, where there's lots of arranged marriages, divorce is a limited option for many, with perhaps our communities or other Asian communities within the UK as well. Any sort of thoughts or reflections on that? Oh, Sheikh, yeah, sorry.
I think you mentioned a few things which might echo with some of our cultural tendencies. Arranged marriage, for example, that's kind of shifting out that story initially. But, I mean, before itself, we're talking about 2023 in the UK. Alongside those similarities, I mean, vast number of the gulf in social disparity between us and men. So I don't think, because we have those cultural similarities, can be mirrored straight over. There's lots of other social factors which affect the outcome of.
Absolutely, yeah. So obviously this is very specific to Nepal. I guess we can sort of try to extrapolate, but there will be other confounders. There'll be other factors within sort of the population that was being looked at there. So we can't sort of completely translate it across to our specifics, but there are some similarities, I guess. But as far as I'm aware, nothing like this has been done within sort of the British Asian culture or British Asian communities. Maybe a bit of research to do at some point. Yeah. Sorry, I think there's someone else had a comment here. Was it? Yeah. Okay. I haven't touched on it. I do have another paper which talks about sort of marriages and marital satisfaction within the Caucasian population. So that'll be coming next, but I haven't looked at it specifically. Yeah. Were there any other comments? I thought there was someone else that was going to say something. No? Okay. So we move on to the third paper. So this is entitled Individuals' Marital Instability Mediates the Association of Their Perceived Childhood Parental Affection Predicting Adulthood Depression Across 18 Years. So again, a huge study, groundbreaking piece of research presented in the Journal of Affective Disorders in 2021. And basically, there are parenting theories that suggest that lack of childhood parental affection increases the risk of vulnerability of the children developing depression in adulthood later on in life. And obviously, there is a link there between affection conferred on the children being heavily reliant on being a part of a supportive, stable marriage unit. So this study involved over 2,800 participants and examined parenting and interpersonal theories by determining if participants' midlife marital instability led to perceived childhood parental affection, and that predicting depressive symptoms in adulthood across 18 years. So what this study found was that those with lower perceived childhood maternal and paternal affection, so basically those children that felt that they had a lack of affection from their mothers and fathers when they're younger, that led to higher levels of depression in the children later on in their adulthood life, 18 years later. And it also suggested that lower maternal and paternal affection in the children can lead to higher marital instability in the children when they grow up and become married later on. So we can see that there's a massive implication here in terms of marital instability leading to sort of risk of depression, risk of mental illness, mental health difficulties in the children, and risk of sort of marital instability later on in life as well. So the findings basically highlight the importance of perceived childhood parental affection towards the children, which can potentially have an influence on the mental health outcomes of the children later on in life. Okay. So the final one that I wanted to sort of touch on is entitled, "Is there something unique about marriage? The relative impact of marital status, relationship quality, and network social support on blood pressure." So we're looking at cardiovascular health here, as well as mental health. And I think this is what I'm sort of alluding to when I think, Siddiqa, you mentioned about sort of love marriages and so on having an impact on whether that has a difference with arranged marriages. This paper doesn't look at that specifically, but it is a study that examines the influence of marital status, relationship quality, and network support on psychological well-being and cardiovascular health. So this was a study that involved 303 participants. 204 were married, 99 were single, and it looked at married individuals, married couples. So there were no unmarried cohabiting people in partnerships included in this study. And married individuals were found to have greater satisfaction with life and reduced blood pressure compared to single individuals. And also the paper found that high marital quality was associated with lower blood pressure levels, lower rates of depression, lower levels of anxiety and stress, and high rates of satisfaction with life. Now, conversely, there was also a finding that suggested that single individuals had lower blood pressure compared to those who are married but in unhappy relationships. So that's quite interesting, actually. So marriage per se is protective of cardiovascular health, of mental health, if it's of good quality. But being single is still better than being in an unhappy relationship. So the conclusions here are that being married per se is not universally beneficial. Rather, it's the satisfaction and support that you might get within that relationship that is so critical. So the support from one's network doesn't necessarily compensate for the effect of being single, and positive marriage experiences may significantly protect from morbidity, so that's sort of ill health, and mortality, risk of sort of death and high early death as well. So coming back to our earlier slides, when I sort of mentioned tranquility, the importance of reconciliation, which is mentioned repeatedly in the Quran. Again, we need to look at how the Quran suggests that reconciliation and achieving that tranquility is so important. And perhaps if you now marry it up with the medical evidence, we can see that tranquility and that sakina that we're sort of supposed to be sort of trying to sort of achieve leads to better health outcomes, whether that's mental health or physical health. So I'd like to sort of end there. I think it's coming up to 8 o'clock. It's just some opportunities for some discussion, reflections. That's all I was going to present. So I don't know if I've answered the question that I initially set out to, which is the key to sanity or the path to distress. I guess I've presented the evidence, and I guess it's up to you guys to sort of reflect and answer that question for yourselves. Yes, there's a comment right at the back. Yeah.
Sorry, 1 second.
So I wanted to go back to the beginning when you were discussing the ayahs of the Quran, and one of them said that if there's no tranquility, something to the effect that it's if you stay within that relationship, then you're doing yourself a disservice or a harm or whatever. So for me, that kind of says that if you're not in a good relationship, then you're better off out of it, which is what the evidence suggests right at the end. You also said that it was a contractual between two parties. However, when it comes to Islamic law, it doesn't seem a lot of parity between how much significance or how much power the male has over the female on whether one wants a divorce or not. And that seems really unfair in my view. Although this is a very uneducated, I know I'm not whatever, this is just, I've just shared this because it came to my mind. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Fatima. So again, I'm not an Islamic scholar. I'm just presenting some evidence. And in terms of the religious background of the talk, that was sort of put together in this piece of research by Sayyid Fatima, Dr. Munzila, and Shaykh Ahmad Qari. So I'm presenting that part of it and then adding in my sort of input from the medical perspective as well. Based on my very limited knowledge of marriage in Islamic law, looking at the Quran, that final verse actually says that if you fear a breach between the two, appoint an arbiter from his family, an arbiter from her family. So it's, based on that verse, it seems very equal, that there should be equal arbitration to achieve reconciliation. And there's, the theme is there throughout, reconciliation is important. But of course, the Quran also talks about retaining them amicably or releasing them amicably as well. So there is that sort of get out clause. If, despite all the efforts, that's my sort of view on it, despite all the efforts, that reconciliation is just not possible. But yeah, I think Shahid.
Thank you, Abbas. My first comment is a slight challenge, and my second is a question. So my first challenge is, a few times you've said the evidence. This shows that this is, and it sounds very cause and effect. And I just want to challenge that and ask about, and maybe think, actually, is it more about association? The fourth study you mentioned talks about physical and mental health and the links. And you described how those different marriage situations lead to, for example, a higher blood pressure. But couldn't it also be an association where people who are unwell physically don't have good relationships because of their physical health? And it might even be other associations. It might be other things that lead to both physical and mental well-being. And it might be their emotional dysregulation, which could lead to higher blood pressure, but maybe at the same time lead to not such a good marriage. And it might not be such to have a diagnostic term associated with it, but it could be the root cause. I just wanted to kind of pose a challenge, similarly with the study from Indonesia, and you described all those odds ratios. It might not be the fact that someone has been widowed that could lead to the depression. It might be the other factor beforehand that could have been such trauma that led to that. It might not be just a transition in marriage. I just wanted to pose a little challenge and maybe say it's not such cause and effect, but there may be associations. Now, my second comment, my second is a question, and you described how in your suggestions, your postulations, that actually the purpose of marriage is tranquility. And then you said, well, if you don't have any tranquility, does that affect the validity of marriage? Then I'm going to ask a question. What about tranquility in other types of relationships which are not heterosexual or not our typical? Yeah, you're not your typical marriage. Even if it's not an intimate relationship, what about other types of couple relationships too, which are not so traditional? Thank you.
Thank you, Shahid. Some really interesting comments. So first of all, in terms of your first comment, I think you're right. All studies come with limitations. That Nepal study tried to sort of adjust for age and various other factors, life situations, to take into account those co-founding factors. There seemed to be a strong correlation or association between, say, for example, those transition to becoming a widow and sort of the onset of major depression. And I guess it's quite dry to sort of go through the critical appraisal of it, but there are weaknesses in every study, and I guess every study always concludes with the fact that actually more research is always needed. So there seems to be a strong correlation, but yes, potentially you can't absolutely prove causality. In terms of your second sort of question stroke comment, interesting. I guess my literature review was very, very specific. So I looked at heterosexual relationships within a marriage rather than people sort of living together, cohabiting within a sort of romantic relationship. So I think we were quite sort of specific about what we wanted to look at, because that sort of poses all sorts of other sort of dilemmas in terms of variations of the different types of relationships, and sort of the Islamic ethical dilemmas about sort of looking at other types of relationships as well. So we were quite sort of specific about what we were looking at. Thank you. Yes, Sheikh.
Thanks, Abbas, for the presentation. Again, I want to touch upon again what Shahid referred to now, and what he also mentioned during the presentation itself. And he made the distinction between the validity of the contract and the utility derived from it. Now, we know, of course, in any system, law by its nature has to be emptied of emotion. Anyway, it is black and white in its nature. If we, I mean, and that verse is looking at the utility of marriage. Of course, if we look at the verses and compare them with those of the prayer, for example, and Allah says, Bismillah ar-Rahman, aqimi salat li dhikri, establish prayer for my remembrance. Now, if someone stands up and prays and is completely does all the physical stuff right, and is completely oblivious of God, or someone fasts and only achieves hunger and thirst as a result of it and is not spiritually enhanced by it, they haven't achieved the utility of the fast or the prayer, but jurisprudentially speaking, it's valid. So the same thing in marriage here, even if the sakina is not achieved to the extent desired, you can say the utility of marriage is not there, but can you question the jurisprudential validity of that contract itself? That's really questionable. And I appreciate that Professor Fatimi et al. Are not here to answer on your behalf, but it's really a bit problematic there.
Okay, thank you. So I'll just conclude now because I know it's namaz time very soon. So yeah, no, thank you. That's a really important comment. So I think the conclusions on the written paper that's due to be published soon. I don't know if you've seen that actually. It's coming out soon, which basically says that we didn't necessarily want to question the validity of the marriage, but what we wanted to do was open up the possibility of a multidisciplinary approach looking at this whole concept. And potentially this multidisciplinary approach can be adapted to look at various other aspects as well. So I think it's that we wanted to highlight most. And I think, the fact that I sort of just put that comment in to invite comments and discussions was purely to sort of invite sort of more people to sort of comment and think about it in a bit more detail. Because yes, Islamic jurisprudence is very black and white. And yes, we can perform namaz and do the actions and go into sajda and ruku and so on. But if we're not sort of achieving that spirituality, that's what it's meant to achieve, again, yeah, it's questionable there. Thank you. Have we got time? There's one more question, or shall we finish? Siddiqa? Yeah. Okay.
Siddiqa, can you pass?
I'm just going to pass a comment, not a question. You mentioned conflict resolution as being one of the ABCs of a successful marriage. What I've recently learned is that conflicts happen in all relationships, as you said, obviously, but it's not about fighting, it's learning how to fight well. And I think when we enter into a marriage, what we need to be taught or given a course on how to fight well, because fightings happen, but we're not taught how to fight well. So I think that leads to a lot of discord and probably bitterness in the relationships. So you may love the person a lot, but then there's a lot of like baggage that you hold on to because of the fights that you've had before. So we need to be taught how to fight well. Maybe that could be your next topic for Bicharo Sajjad.
Thank you, Siddiqa. I don't know if I'd agree, to be honest. We could talk about that over iftar, but actually, rather than fighting, I would argue that actually it should be about sort of bringing out that compassion and that empathy within each other to achieve that tranquility. So that's what I was trying to look at, really. But I guess in this holy month of Ramadan, I pray that we are all able to achieve and emulate the amazing unions of those holy personalities that we sort of look towards and look up to, like Bibi Fatima, Imam Ali, like the Prophet and Bibi Khadija. And with that, I'd like to end. I'd thank you very much for all the sort of very enthusiastic discussions and comments and questions. I hope it's just opened up a bit of a discussion and a debate. Again, I was just here to sort of pose a question rather than give any answers, and I've just sort of let that sort of question open up and lead it for you to sort of conclude yourselves. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Thank you so much, Abbas, and I'm sure there'll be plenty of people who'll want to talk to you afterwards. Can you please kindly note that tomorrow there will be no T4C program as AMI will be holding their big iftar. So our next and final program for this month will be inshallah next Thursday, which will be a special Eid night celebration with a special menu as well. Will inshallah start at 7 p.m. with the Quran and Dua Bida, and a presentation by all the children who took part in the Time for Learning, and followed by a prize giving ceremony. We'll share some video clips, and we'll finish with the Ramzan quiz for all ages. The poster will be out in the next couple of days. If I can please ask you to register as soon as possible for the last event. And please feel free to bring family and friends to celebrate with us as well for this last iftar of the month. The deadline to send your video clips is this Sunday. So please, if you could please give us a short clip, just 1 minute, with the feedback of your experience with T4C, would be really appreciated. It would really help us to promote T4C. And the videos will be shown next Thursday and also on our social media platforms. Also, many of you have asked us if you're organizing anything special for Eid Day following, Eid Namaz next Friday, and the answer is no. We're having a break, so inshallah there will be only the usual, Eid Namaz, and that's organized by AMI, but we will not be doing anything on Eid Day. Sorry about that. Also, so we would like to make our Eid night program a bit more special next Thursday, and we're in need of your donations. So just to give you an idea, we're going to have altogether, inshallah, 15 programs in this month of Ramadan, and the cost adds up to almost £10,000, which is a lot more that we expected compared to last year. But alhamdulillah, with the increased attendance, and we are still in need of about £3,000 in donations to cover all the cost of this month. So please, we kindly and humbly request you to, I know you have already donated, very generously, but to please carry on in this last week so we can cover all the costs. You can donate by cash. You can approach me for card donations. You have the PayPal link. You have the bank details. You pick and choose. Just donate, please. And you know that also we have been supporting Huiz Hussein Birmingham. So this is the last week of the month of Ramadan. So please keep on donating generously towards this worthy cause. With just £2, you can provide a hot meal and a drink for a person in need. Can I please request you all to recite a Surah Fatiha for all those who are unwell, for all the marhumin whose names are on the screen, and all marhumin. Al-Fatiha. Iftar will be served after Maghrib Salat in the dining room. As usual, you know the drill. Just be seated at your tables and you'll be served there. And if you can please help us to clear your table afterwards. If you request vegetarian option or the children need a dairy-free options for the wrap, then please ask one of the volunteers. And if you can kindly request you to keep your children under your supervision with you at all times, and that access in the chapel will not be allowed. And Namaz, Isha Salat will inshallah be prayed at 9:30 p.m. here. Thank you.